This is Empowered Human Academy. Welcome home.
You belong in the room, and until you believe you belong in the room, can't convince other people that you do.
This is about love. This is about light. This is about the idea that you have everything you will ever need.
And this life of yours, this is where you grow, you expand, and you remember who you really are.
I'm Abe.
I'm Isaac.
In Empowered Human Academy, we join with humans of all kinds to feel the inspiration that can only come with empowered living.
The stories you hear today are unique, but the energy you hear today belongs to you too. So, with hearts wide open, let's begin.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's conversation. We are bringing together people that we know in our lives that have made an impact on us and who we find really inspiring. And this week, we have our friend Lisa Wardell, a former neighbor of ours who is the CEO and chairperson of the Adtalem company, and she's the only Black female CEO in the Fortune 1000. And we find her super inspiring. So we're just going to have a really, really honest and real conversation today about life, about business, and about how we think we can make the world a little bit better around us. So without further ado, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. You've become a friend in the last year plus, and it's been really awesome learning from you and connecting with you. And thanks for joining us today. I wanted to start off with giving you some time to share a little bit about who you are and what you're about, and we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Well, I am, as you said, I run an education company. Everything we do is about education mission. But the reason for that, which really says a lot about who I am, is that I'm a first generation college grad. My dad was a baggage handler for United for most of his work in life. My mom was a nurse. At that time, you did not have to go to college to be a nurse. And so hardworking parents. And they always knew that education is really something that gives you access to options in your life. So from a very early age, first of all, I liked reading. I liked education. And so I went through high school and went to college as the first in my family. And so because of that, even though I went on to law school and then actually business school and pursued more financial and private equity and strategic consulting, I always knew that at the end of the day, I wanted to go back to figuring out how to get education to more people. And we've talked about this, like access to education, like the 4-year degrees, not for everyone. We have 4-year degrees. We have a large nursing school at Adtalem, but there's also all kinds of short courses and certifications and skills that people can get to, be able to build their career and get new and different jobs. So that's like my motivation now. And I also believe that everybody, not just women, everybody can have families and do great things and have a mission and work and all of that. So as a result, I also have 3 kids. I am a blended family. So we have 6 kids. I had 3 biological, 3 stepkids, big family, and we just make it work and make it happen. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. That's fantastic. When you if we draw back for a moment, so we've touched on a bunch of different things, like your family history,
Yep.
your family that you had, your blended family, your professional activity. You've got a lot of different things going on. At the center of that, that's you. How do you describe like the core essence that is yourself? How do you self-describe?
Yeah, so I self-describe as a lifelong learner. I want to always be challenging the lens that I'm looking through because I know it's mine and it's unique, but I know it's different from others. And boy, has that been, something very useful over the last couple of months, right? I'm also, I think, very confident in myself, but also humble. I try to make sure that I understand that what I have comes from everyone that came before me, everyone that supports me, my faith. I do feel that sort of your internal grounding is really what's there. And we're all seeing that now when everything else is uncertain. And so from my perspective, it is about being transparent and being truthful and real enough that people believe in you and your legacy and what you can do. And then people will follow you if you're doing things that are making the world better. That's kind of how I would self-describe, at least what I aspire to. Obviously, I have bad days too.
That totally makes sense. Did you always see yourself stepping into a leadership position such as you're in right now, or was that a surprise as you followed your own internal goals? What's the relationship with that path?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Certainly I was not one of those people who always said, I want to be a CEO and I want to run a public company. Never that. I did feel that I would be a leader because I felt like I had something to offer to the world. So I would say even when I was practicing law or post-law, when I went into basically doing deals and helping companies come together, I knew that I had something to offer, but this was much more of a just came into my path. I think in terms of just positive thoughts and people who have helped me get into that channel and that pathway.
So you sent me a couple articles that you've been in Business Insider, New York Times, which is so cool to see you show up and shine in those areas. And in one of those articles, you talk about people who've invested in you and seen the potential. Can you share a little bit more about that? And why that's
Yes. So I was asked if I would like to do a profile actually in the Wall Street Journal, which of course I was very excited about. But the idea behind this profile was, who are the people who have influenced you? And for me, I have had for many years now a personal board of directors. And so it was a perfect profile. And what a personal board of directors is for anyone, I highly recommend it, is those people who can help you not just say, oh, Abe, you are great. What you're doing is great. You need those people, but can push back and say, hey, Abe, this is the next step for you. Or, hey, Isaac, have you thought about this? And the most important thing about a personal board of directors is it should change over time as you evolve. Some people will remain sort of those, strongholds in your life. But some will change and mature as you change and mature, not only professionally, but personally. And so for my personal board of directors, one thing I think that's neat about it during these times is it is Black men, it is white men, it is white women, it is there's Black woman. So it is across a whole spectrum of people who don't just look like me. I happen to be a Black woman, but there have been people who have helped me in a far broader spectrum. So I think that's important as we think about today's climate. And so what this article did was really ask, what's the best advice that those folks have given you? And it's not always comfortable things. Sometimes it can be very uncomfortable things. It's everything from, I was talking about Mac McClarty, who is a former chief of staff in actually President Clinton's White House. I worked with him for many years in the automotive business. And he said to me, you ought to send people personal written notes, snail mail, because people just are so busy today and they don't do that. And they don't recognize that that's a personal investment of time. You have to sit, you have to make sure you mail it. And I've done it ever since. And what was so funny was when the article came out, I got a bunch of emails from people saying, I still have the note that you sent me when we started this business, Red Arts Capital, or I still have the note you sent me when I got this promotion into this job. And so that was good advice. But that's the idea of a personal board of directors.
I'm fascinated by the notion of adding people on or letting people go as you yourself evolve. Can you kind of describe that process? Like how you, I guess I could guess, no, I don't even want to guess. What is it like to realize you need somebody new or to realize that you need to let somebody go?
Yeah. And so the let somebody go, you sort of don't call them up and say, hey, guess what? You're no longer on my personal board of directors, of course. But as people come in and out of your life, right, of course, you spend more time or less time. For me now, I have recently talked to an individual who is a public company CEO of a much larger scaled company than mine, because the company I run is a couple of $1 billion. If you think about what it takes and how you would think about a larger scaled company, if that's the path that is chosen for me and that I choose. You would need somebody that has stepped in those shoes. And so and what you do when you add people is first of all, it's got to be a personal connection. I mean, Abe and I talk about that all the time. You've got to have a personal connection, and then you've got to be able to offer a lot to that person too, because that's the only way that you can build, as you know, that kind of mutual connection, both connection, respect, but also giving. I find that if you don't have a lot to give in any particular scenario or situation, it's just going to be harder to get what you want. So or what you need. And so that's how I would sort of describe it's a evolving and ever flowing type of group.
I love that. And with that group, do you specifically look for people who resonate with you energetically? Like, I found that, like, with the friends that I have, they're all very different, and they offer so many different perspectives that I can think about and apply to my life. But the consistency of the energy within those groups is super important to us. And I'm just curious how you kind of pick and choose. Like, if someone's a little more like harsher than your style, are you more comfortable with that? What's kind of your what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so I guess I've used maybe a different word than energy. So it is energy as in connection, but for me, what I start with is this sort of one or two cornerstones. I know there's supposed to be one cornerstone, but one or two, and I would say transparency. I need somebody, obviously integrity and things like that. You're not friends with people who do bad things that you know of, but transparency in terms of how they communicate, because I am so open and transparent. It's hard for me to connect if people are not, or they're more subtle. I just don't get it. So that's one. And then the other is this notion, which I think might be getting to your energy, this notion of, humor and opportunity and what's the bright side. Like, I am an eternal optimist. So as we've been going through this pandemic, I'm like, what are the good things that have come out of this? Just the time spent outside, as in outside in nature, not outside on the way to the mall or whatever it is, right? I'm just one of those people. And so, I find that people that have that like mind tend to want to be around me more, because, if you're more of a, even pragmatist, but certainly a pessimist, I find that that's, I guess, bad energy.
Totally.
No, that makes sense. And I love that about you. Like, since all throughout our friendship, I've known the eternal optimism side of it. And as we've talked with you, you've also spoken about your transparency and how that works with your own leadership position at your company. So in the period that we're in with COVID-19 and the national discussion that we're finally having about racial inequity at the scale, what is the optimism plus the transparency plus your general earnestness? How does that all play into your leadership role at your company, at the helm of this large company?
Yeah, so let me start with, I'll start with COVID-19, because obviously that sort of started first in terms of CEOs speaking out.
Sure.
And there, first of all, I tripled the amount of communication, and I do videos every Friday for the organization, because all of a sudden people are, we're remote. We shut down, I think, March 13th, and we have not, been back in the office together. And so, again, looking through that lens, what I tried to do was really make sure that I was getting everybody's perspective and providing empathy for that. When we think about COVID-19, from my perspective, really the number one thing has to be empathy. And so I'll give you an example. For me, it was homeschooling, and I did this video, I'll send it to you, interviewing Grace on how I was doing on homeschooling, and I basically got like a 1 out of 10. And I got all of these things back saying, oh my gosh, it's so hard. But then what's interesting is we also have so many people who are sheltering in place, or now, fully restricted, alone. Right. And I don't have that problem. I'm like, I'd love to be alone, sheltering in place for a couple of days. But that is such a hard, not the lens I'm looking through, but a really difficult thing. So I tried to address that too. Fast forward a couple of months, and I will tell you that actually George Floyd's death was the first time that I have spoken out on racial injustice in my company.
Sure.
Now, and I think what you'll find is many CEOs, many leaders have continued to speak out on diversity and inclusion, of course, of all types, racial, ethnicity, LGBTQ, everything. There's no question. But I found that at this moment, it needed to be about racial injustice and actually using those words, Black, white, race,
Yep.
tragedy. And so I put out a statement, and then, true to form, really tried to pivot to how can we start having really hard conversations within the organization. They're optional. Everybody is not going to want to have those conversations. We had a virtual town hall. We put out a couple of books and different things, and Harvard has like a bias test that you can take and see what your biases are, et cetera. And so you could be into it as much as you wanted. But we had about 2,000 people come onto this kind of like Zoom platform live for this virtual town hall. And we talked about how it feels to be Black in America, what healthcare disparities and how that shows up, white privilege and what that means from both sides, et cetera. And it's interesting because before that town hall, I had put out a communication, a video just like this, and I got a couple of emails back from white employees saying, why do we have to talk about this? There's plenty of problems. There's what about the police officers? I'm married to a police officer, and I'm afraid for him. And just because he's white doesn't mean it doesn't matter, et cetera, et cetera. And the way that first of all, I wrote her back and said, it was so brave, like 300 people can write to me and say, oh, you're such a great CEO, you're bringing out, but to write to the CEO with your name on it and where you work in the organization and say, I don't like what you said. I thought that was so brave, and I hope you join the town hall. You know what? She did. And I also, in the town hall, and she wasn't the only one, I had 2 or 3 emails like that. And I said, that is the beginning of change.
100%.
Right? Not the Black people saying, you're such a great Black CEO. Of course not. I mean, I love that. I love the support,
Sure.
But that's where the change comes. So that's why I'm optimistic about this time, this moment.
So how have you kind of pivoted that conversation? Can you share a little bit of what that conversation has looked like? What are kind of some internal things that you've brought maybe to that conversation that were you vulnerable in a new way, or kind of share what that looked like for you?
Yeah, so there were two themes. I'll start there and then I'll give you a couple examples for myself. There were 2 themes that I wanted to sort of bring across. The first I've talked about a little bit, which is your lens. We're simply asking you to look through understand that there are different lenses, and then look through a different lens than the one you're looking through, whether we do that through books or articles or videos. We had some videos of some folks talking about how things had affected them in their lives, et cetera. So one is lens, but the other really important piece is separating this notion of racist acts and words and thoughts and biases with racism. Because what's happened is folks who want to drive that systemic racism, racist systems have said, if you admit, as anybody, Black, white, or anybody, but particularly white, if you admit that you said or did something that's racist, you're bad. Mm-hmm. Well, that's absolutely untrue. You could not have grown up in this country, whether you're my age or much younger your age, mm-hmm. You cannot have existed in this country unless you have had racist thoughts, impressions, biases brought into your world, whether that is the I don't see color, good racist thing, or it's, oh my gosh, I don't like Black people or this people or that people. It's not possible. So if you start from there, Black or white, so if you start from there, and everything else, and so if you start from there, it then starts to become easier to have the dialogue, which we're trying to currently have in my company, which is, what do you say when you don't know what to say? So that's what we're tackling next.
Amazing. And I've had really great conversations with my friends of all different races, specifically Black friends, in the safe space, because I know that it's a burden for a lot of Black people to be like, I don't want to educate you. Like,
Right.
that's my thing. But
Right.
we, and I have the type of friendships where I can be like, yo, tell
You
me.
need
Like,
to ask. Yeah.
yeah, totally. But the work takes a long time, and it needs to be sustainable, because think about how long racism has been such an inherent thing in all of us.
Right.
So going from like, I really honor the response that you gave your employee, saying like, you're brave, like, thank you. This is how the conversation starts. And this is how change starts, versus, well, screw you, I'm going to fire you, or whatever it is.
Right.
That does nothing. That only creates a bigger bridge. I mean, burns the bridge, whatever it is.
A bigger chasm.
Yes, absolutely. So kind of segueing into more, I want to touch more about race. Yes. What, you are one of the or the only Black female CEO?
There is one other Black female CEO that I know of, not in the S&P or Fortune.
Okay, got it. So what has been your experience like, just broadly? Just, I want to get real for a second. Like, as a woman and as a Black woman, like, what has your experience been like since you've taken role in
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I think in terms of being a Black woman executive, I had already had a lot of those experiences that sort of shaped that. So I have been, asked to pour the coffee when I walk in the room. I've been asked when the CEO is going to show up and things like that, throughout my career, which is very, very common for Blacks, Latinx. It's very common for executives.
Crazy.
Again, because when we think about a public company CEO, we have a picture in our mind, and it doesn't look like me or you. It just doesn't. And so we have to educate that and break through that. And I always use humor anytime there's anything like that. I always use humor to kind of break it, because I don't want people to get more uncomfortable rather than less. So that is so that's the first thing. But when I came in, it's interesting because people feel like if you are a Black executive, you may not be held to the same standards around diversity. I did not have a diverse team when I came in. And in fact, it's the opposite. It's sort of like, well, you are a Black CEO, like, what's going on with your non-diverse management team? Or, we had a pretty diverse board, but needed to make it more diverse. And so there's more pressure there. And we absolutely did that. And my team today is quite diverse, as is my board. But the other thing is that that's only impactful if, in fact, you're then making it's giving you a business advantage and imperative, right? And so the reason, part of the problem is we don't tell people the reason that we need to push for diversity. The reason that we're pushing for diversity is because let's just take the US, our country, the demographics are changing, right? And so if people are making decisions in the boardroom about which medicines, pharmaceuticals should be, approved, and how education should look, and how people learn, and when people will go to the doctor, in our case, we're in medical and healthcare, and none of those people understand the communities where Black and brown people live, we won't make the right decisions. There's just no question. And so there's an economic reason. In addition to, it's the right thing to do because people have been left out of these rooms.
That's super interesting. So making sure I understand you correctly, like, diversity, it's an actual imperative to ensure the business stays competitive and healthy over time.
Absolutely. Yes. You said it much better than me. Yes.
No, that's super cool. I was about to ask you a question about the balance between like being a woman and a Black woman in leadership, what the balance is between, like, perhaps feeling like you have to be a figurehead of some sort, like to be the minority in a room, knowing that you are attracting more attention, perhaps just because of these attributes. The balance between knowing that you have an example to set versus just doing the job that you want to do. I wanted to ask about that. It sounds like it might actually be very aligned, because if diversity is actually a requirement in the business doing well, perhaps those aren't two sides. Perhaps those two things aren't in conflict. But does that make sense? Can you kind of speak to that?
It does. I think there's a little bit of both. It kind of goes to what Abe was saying in terms of educating, right? And don't, it's tiring to always be the educator. For me, I want to do that. Let's do it. But I would say, to your point, yes, from one perspective, diversity aligns with the business. But from another, I'll just give you an example. I was on a panel a couple of years ago, and somebody said to me, well, what are you going to do for the women in your company and, the Black women in your company and outside your company who are looking to you to say, we could get to that role? And I remember I said, I'm going to do what all of my white male counterparts do. I am going to make my numbers, make my operating income, move my stock up, because if I don't, no Black woman will ever be in this seat again, because the focus is on me, right? So it's that balance between, now it's changing, because I think my white male counterparts do have to think about this now, particularly in the last couple months, which is why it gives me such great hope for momentum that'll be different this time. And they are thinking about it and stepping up. There's no question. You see that across corporate America. I'm very proud. But at the same time, that takes a lot of your time, and you do have to focus and say, my job, my fiduciary duty is to my investors and my shareholders who have hundreds of millions of dollars in this company. And we need to, they care about ESG, they care about environmental, social, and governance, but that has to be in a way that we are also, making their investment worthwhile and giving them a return on investment. So it is a balance. You've got it right.
That's fantastic. I appreciate that you have such a focus on keeping this thing sustainable. Like, a couple themes that I've heard from you so far are like being ever conscious of the lens that you're using and making sure that it accounts for things that perspectives that maybe aren't natural or endemic to you. And then also the sustainability side of that you're focused so hard on making sure that you can continue to do this tomorrow, that the company will be competitive tomorrow, and all this. That makes sense. Speaking one more time about the conversation within the company and the letters that you received, a couple dissenting voices, how do you make sure that conversation stays active and sustainable, and that it's not just like you and leadership, but the entire company is having these dialogues and moving forward to the place consistently over time?
Yeah. So the phrase is what Abe used was a safe space, right? And so there's so much we can do on a town hall with 2,000 people. The real work, and we do make a difference there. If only to allow people to understand that it is okay in our organization to say words like race, Black, white, Black Lives Matter. That is reason enough to have those. But what I have tasked my team and then their teams to do, it only works if we have the small group discussions, right? The intergroup discussions. If you get 6 to 8 people who work together, maybe on a team or a project, and they're able to have these conversations, and they feel safer about it because they've all sort of heard the CEO use these words that, you don't usually say, et cetera. And so that, I think, has been hopeful. And so what we are doing is we're tasking people to have these small groups. Let's get together. Some of them picked books. One group I know picked a book called So You Want to Talk About Race. I have not read that one yet, but I just read White Fragility, which another group picked. They could pick their own book, and of course it's optional. And then we'll go through a few weeks of that, and then we'll have another town hall to talk about, okay, how do we, because if you're asking people to talk about race, then they're going to do what you did. They're going to want to go talk to people who will answer their questions or, listen to their perspective. And so you can't open that can of worms and then say, okay, well, don't ask us anything because we don't want to talk about it. We just want to tell you how bad you are at it, right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So
I appreciate your, I appreciate that your commitment to really, this is another theme. I appreciate that your commitment to these things is like in no way doing just lip service to the concepts. That's, I want to work for you. That's awesome.
Oh, thank you. And it's not overnight. As you said, it's not overnight. This is like consistent. And I tell you, it's interesting. The one thing that I put in my statement about George Floyd, I said, the real tragedy here is that this is not an extraordinary event, that it happens all the time. And how are we to know that just 2, maybe 3 weeks later, exact thing happened again? And so that, I think, is what's driving the momentum to say we have to change the underlying construct, right?
Totally.
So.
Totally. I have a couple more questions.
Yes.
How do you, so I've always been I've always been a cheerleader for the underdog, for, you know, the Black, the gay, the whatever doesn't fit the society
Right.
mold in terms of leadership or who belongs where. So how would you encourage people who society or, you know, white supremacy would say you do not belong in these positions? How would you encourage them to continue going to show up and be represented at the table, where people make decisions, where impact is made?
Yeah, great question. So the first is just recognizing that there are people who, like you and like me, who really want them to succeed, who are really there to be supportive, who are really there to let them know they belong in the room, right? So a lot of times it does start with young people because you know they still have this great sort of I can do anything, and I try to just foster that whenever I can. 2 years ago, I spoke at a dinner from some young people in New York who had just gotten scholarships, and the topic was you belong in the room, and until you believe you belong in the room, can't convince other people that you do. And so a lot of it is self-made. I mean, obviously, you know, you need help, and that's why I talked about the personal board of directors. But I just said you can absolutely do anything, and you can change people's perspective through this whole lens notion.
And what would be kind of a call to other businesses and other leaders right now that you would have to give people this space to show up?
Yes. So I think a couple of things. I think one is now is the time for corporate leadership to really say, we are not going to hide behind the more comfortable terms. I mentioned diversity inclusion. Of course, I'm a big champion of diversity inclusion, but I actually said to my team, I guess 3 years ago, I said, you know what, stop saying to me inclusion, because we don't have anybody to include. When you show me the people in our organization who are transgender or who are Black or who are, you know, Black but in roles that they typically would not be in, or whatever the case may be, Latinx, then we can talk about how we are about diversity and inclusion. We got to have something to include first. So things like that, right? And then also the call to action around tangible results. So as an example, for all corporate leaders or just anybody who's in a leadership position, there are small businesses that are minority owned, they're women owned, they provide you know, different services and products to companies, and it's just sometimes harder to do business with them because they don't have the big machine, and you've got to take the time to be able to do that. If you're hiring a law firm, or even if you're a small business and you're hiring whatever it is, you're hiring a caterer or a photographer, whatever it is, you know, you ask them, do you have any diversity in your company? Because we'd like to, you don't have to be, it doesn't have to be owned that way, but do you have anybody that works with you? That makes a difference. I don't have law firms that come to our company without a diverse team. They know not to show up that way. So in a very positive way.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. How did they learn that? Have you turned away folks who are non-diverse, or how do you?
You know what? I have called the question. So I have had meetings where I've walked in and, you know, it's 10 white guys. Sometimes they have the same shirt and tie on. I even laugh, like literally it's a uniform. And I say, hey, do you have any diversity on your team? And first of all, you could tell a lot of times they haven't been asked. A lot of times they don't know how to answer the question. And then I sort of, even though that is a little bit fun when you do it, I then sort of try to help through that and say, you know, well, here's what we look for. And you know, I would say 8 times out of 10, you know, they will come back to, you know, back to the table with more diversity now, and maybe junior diversity, depending on, you know, maybe folks who are not managing partners as an example, but they will do that. And I will tell you 2 things. First of all, it is a great signal to my employees of my company, right? A wonderful signal when I go in these rooms and they see me do that. They recognize, she's really talking the talk, right? And the second is I have had conversations like that where senior people, one example, a senior Black woman was brought onto an account. She has worked for this particular company for 28 years. And she called me and said, no CEO has ever done that. I am so thrilled. And she has been fabulous. She's like, I've been here 28 years. I'm sure she gets paid well and everything else, but no one had said, I'm not going to do business with you unless you put this woman on my account. And she's phenomenal at what she does. She's not there because she's a Black woman.
Totally.
So just things like that. They're not that big. It's not rocket science. But if we all did it.
I love that. I love that. Like, calling the question, like you said, just very straightforwardly saying the thing that may not have ever been said before. But then not turn it into a question or not turn it into an indictment or a shaming thing, but
yes, exactly.
Inviting them to get better. That's phenomenal.
Yeah. Because if you just sort of slap their hand, then everyone feels bad. And it's not like any minorities are then going to get a job because, you have to balance it.
I respect that so much. Amazing.
Thank you.
I want to rewind to, so you said two things now that feel tied together. Way early in the conversation, you said you did feel like someday you might be a leader because you felt you had something to offer. And then much later in the conversation, you said like, until you believe you belong in the room, you're not going to convince anyone that you are. Is that a sense that you've always had, that kind of worthiness, or is that something that you work for? And what would you tell other people who are still working on that sense for themselves?
Got it. Okay. So a little bit of both. So I would say I always, from my first job when I was a teenager working in a shoe store, I knew that I could do things. I could learn pretty much anything I wanted to learn. I could learn. I learned that through literally working in retail. But so I did have a bit of that. But I really got the you belong in the room when I worked at my former job before this one for a gentleman named Bob Johnson. A couple of articles have lots of articles I've written about him, but I've talked about him in a couple of articles called RLJ. And he would put me in all sorts of situations where I was very young, like maybe 30 for a corporate, executive room. And he would just say, well, Lisa, you run the meeting, or, put me in those situations where you have to do it. And it's interesting. This is a great story to tie what we just talked about. We went to New York once. It was Bob and me, just the two of us. And we were going to meet with a very large investment bank. And we walked in the room, and there were literally, I think 12 or 14 bankers in this room, all white males. And Bob is an African-American man. And literally, Bob sits down. Of course, they all stand up when you come in. You shake hands, and used to shake hands, and then sit down. And Bob sits down, and he says, I cannot believe that you didn't bring any diverse people into this meeting, knowing you were going to meet with the only Black billionaire in the country. He's like, you didn't even bring the analyst that you keep in the back room. And then he just starts laughing. He just cracks up, and everyone is frozen, including me. They're just all like this. Like, I don't know if you can see my eyes. They're just frozen like, oh my God, did he just say that? And then he looks at me and he goes, Lisa, go ahead, run the meeting. And so I'm like, oh, it's good to see you guys. How's the weather? Like, it was, so I go through the whole meeting, and then we go in the car, and I'm mad. I was like, why'd you do that to me? Like, it was so embarrassing. And I was like, why did you say that? And he said, because Lisa, until you believe you belong in the room, you don't belong in the room. And so that's what I tell all young people. That's a true story.
I think that's incredible, and I love the humanity in that. A reason why I wanted to chat with you is because I've always been fascinated with people in leadership positions to get to know them on a human level, on a person-to-person level, because at the end of the day, we're all humans, and we all have fears, and we all get scared, or we're all intimidated sometimes, and we all achieve. Like, we're very similar. And what I like to kind of dive into in our conversations is like, purpose and goals and all these things that matter. And I just love the humanity that you brought to this conversation today. And just thank you. I have two more questions. One question, what are you most hopeful for in the next year or two, business, life, the world? open question.
Oh, absolutely. That's an easy one. The world is a different perspective and momentum on racial and social justice. And I mean that across, access to education, healthcare disparities, certainly this racial, which is a social construct, but this racism dialogue, et cetera. I believe it's different this time, and we're not going to solve it. You said a couple of years, it's not going to be solved, but we are going to come out of this stronger, regardless of what happens in the election, regardless of the pandemic. The pandemic is going to end. We are going to get a vaccine. We are going to go back to at least a new normal, but we are going to have a different viewpoint. It is different this time than any time in history. And so I am most hopeful about that. I believe it. I believe it's going to happen.
I can tell.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. We end off every conversation with a question. What do you know for sure?
That I am loved, and that I have the capacity to give even more love than I get, and I get a lot. That's what I know for sure.
Awesome.
I love there's kind of light coming from you actually right now, and it's actually perfect timing because I'm all about that. I love you, Lisa. You're such an amazing,
I love you too.
Such an inspiration. So many people can learn from you and just gain so much insight about business and life. I know we have.
Oh, for sure. I've several times through this conversation I've done this, but I want to applaud again your integrity and positive intent. I've heard that very, very consistently across all facets that we've discussed, and I'm sure more that we haven't discussed. So thank you for being that person.
So folks who are watching this, I encourage you to Google Lisa Wardell and learn more about her story and the incredible leader that she is. Lisa, thank you so much. You are loved, and we're so grateful to be a recipient of your love and the love that you share to the world. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I love you guys.
This podcast is the work of Lightward, our company, named for that toward the light direction which informs every single thing that we do, including money, which means, like everything else, the way we earn revenue is not based on industry norms. It's based on what feels deeply right and aligned by passing through the door that feels like it has more behind it, not less. And the way we keep this podcast going is all Lightward. It's pay what feels good. It's an exchange of value between you and us. We're keeping conventional podcast advertising totally out of this. And here's how Pay What Feels Good works. We give you this episode because it feels good to do so. And you consider, honestly, what number of dollars this episode is genuinely worth to you. I do not care if that's $3, $1,000, or literally $0 and a heart emoji, as long as that trade genuinely makes your day better. And the energy there is the entire point. That is what we're building our business on. No advertisers, no selling your attention, just you and us, trading value in a way that builds us both up. So whatever the number, when you're done listening, head to empoweredhumanacademy.com and hit the Pay What Feels Good button. We use this policy across all of our company's work, and I'm really excited to bring it here to the world of podcasts. This is us voting for the world we want to see. Thank you for being here.